Hi, this is AJ Hartley. I've been thinking about doing some videos in response to questions that I get sometimes by email or at conventions and things like that, where people say, "What's your favorite book of yours?" Which is, like trying to pick between your children, something I know nothing about because I only have one child. But I thought what I would do was to do a number of little mini talkback sessions where I went through my own catalog and talked about the things that I like about each book, or what it was that I was going for, what it was that I liked or valued. The general rule, of course, is that there's always something, right? There's always an element in a story that you're proud of, or that you think worked, or you hope worked for a particular reason. And so I thought it would be useful or interesting to maybe stroll through some of those and see if I could identify some of the things that I value in what I'm trying to do. And I thought that a good place to start would be with what is my most recent standalone book, which is this, Impervious, which is out now from Falstaff Books in the US and from UCLan Publishing in the UK, with a very different look, a different cover. And I'll talk about that maybe in a minute, because I think the differences are interesting. But I wanted to talk about what this story is and why I chose to write it, and the circumstances from which it emerged, which are unusually specific for my kind of writing. As you may already know, it's technically a YA, a young adult novel, but as is often the case with my YA stuff, it's YA primarily because the protagonist is of a teen age, rather than it being traditionally young adult in its preoccupations or concerns. I'm not certain if that's absolutely true, but that's the way I think of it. For me, writing a YA novel doesn't mean dealing with less adult subject matter. It means having a particular character perspective. And this has caused a certain amount of consternation from people who have read it. I actually got there's an Amazon review that I saw, which said that it was a good story and everything, but it was too mature for a YA audience, which is sort of painful in lots of ways, not least of which is that the subject matter of the story specifically affects young adult people. So if the subject matter is too adult, that says something about the world rather than about the story. Anyway, so it's a fantasy in the tradition of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and that kind of storytelling, where we have, in this case, a high school girl who becomes a kind of superhero. She overnight, she gets possession of a necklace, which comes to her in somewhat mysterious circumstances, with a little sword on the pendant. And as soon as she gets it, she loses her sort of klutzy awkwardness and becomes deft, skilled, particularly with blades of any kind, but particularly with swords. And there's this sense of a personal destiny, that something bad is coming, that she and only she can fight using this new ability. Now, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but it's clear as you work your way through the story that there's something a little off about this narrative. Something happens early in the book, and from that point on, as the fantasy dimension takes over, and she's battling, monsters and dealing with things that are clearly magical, we occasionally get these moments that say something else is going on here. And this is a kind of story that I've always loved, and I'm trying to remember the first examples that I read that got me enthusiastic about it. And one of them, somewhat strangely perhaps, is a William Golding novel, the guy who wrote Lord of the Flies, called Pincher Martin, which I read as an undergraduate in Manchester long ago. I don't think I read it for a class. I think I read it as a kind of having studied Lord of the Flies, I wanted to read more Golding and learn more about what he was doing. And this particular novel is set in the Second World War. It follows the captain of a ship of some sort. And in the very beginning of the story, the ship is torpedoed by a German U-boat, I think. I don't remember. I haven't read it for a long time. And everybody goes overboard and everybody's drowning. And we're very close to the point of view of this particular character. The first thing he does once he's in the water to stay afloat is he kicks his sea boots off. And then he swims. They're in the middle of the Atlantic, so his chances of survival are virtually zero. But by some spectacular piece of good fortune, he stumbles on this rock sticking out of the middle of the ocean, and he climbs onto it, and the rest of the novel is about him trying to stay alive on this barren piece of rock, eating whatever shellfish he can find and collecting rainwater from the crevices in the rock and so on. But periodically in the story there are these moments where odd things happen, and you start to get the sense that there's something wrong with this narrative. And at the same time, we're learning about the character himself. And the character is sort of a monster, an egotist, extraordinarily arrogant and demanding, and defiant. That's the word that I always think of. And again, this book has been out, I don't know, 60 years or something, so I'm not going to worry too much about spoiling it. But when some of these strange things happen, there's this odd sense in which the world in which he's living isn't real. And at the end of the book, as this world has sort of collapsed, we see, I think it's for the first time, outside of his perspective, we see a body being washed ashore in Scotland or the Orkneys or somewhere like that. And it's him. And he's drowned. And somebody remarks upon how terrible it is to drown. And somebody else says, well, at least it was fast. He didn't have time to kick his sea boots off. And so if you hadn't got it beforehand, you realize that the entire story and that the time that he's swimming to this little rock and living on it and sustaining himself, all of that has been a kind of mental construction on the part of a drowning man, trying to cling to something to keep him alive. And it's a remarkable sort of tour de force as a novel, and it really sort of, it made an impression on me. And I love those kind of stories, and fantasy and sci-fi, I think, have played with it in other genres. There's Star Trek episodes, Next Generation episodes, and there are Buffy episodes, where the ostensible rules of the show temporarily seem to go away. There's a Next Generation episode when the crew wake up on the ship and they have a mission to go and destroy some headquarters of some rival civilization, and there's a new first officer who we've never seen before who's giving all the instructions, and gradually we start to realize that something is wrong, or there are those episodes with Riker when he's in the play State of Mind or something like, I think it's called, and he is experiencing this fiction. There's another one with Geordi. So there's a whole series of these episodes where you're watching it and you're thinking, what's really happening? That there's a fiction at work within the fiction, on a deeper level, on a truer level, as it were. And that's what I wanted to do with Impervious. The circumstances of the story I'm recording this video in July of 2020, hence the COVID lack of haircut, um, which is a little over a year since I was on campus at the school where I teach, University of North Carolina in Charlotte, when we were gathered together for an end of semester celebration of our students. And in a neighboring building, somebody showed up and started shooting. And it was chaos and traumatic. And, we took shelter with the students who were with us. The faculty divided up. I was with about 5 or 6 students. And we hid in a dressing room for close to 2 hours while we waited for the incident to end, for the police SWAT teams to come and clear us. And of course, we didn't know what was going on. We were trying to follow local news reports and so on. The message that came through the school emergency system that showed up on our phones was run, hide, fight, in that order, right? So running, by the time we got the message, it was too late. So we hid with and prepared to fight if somebody came in shooting. And it was rough, and I think 6 students were shot. 2 students in particular were killed, Reed Parlier and Riley Howell, the latter of whom was responsible to a large extent for subduing, disarming the shooter, though he was shot multiple times and killed in the process. And I wanted to write a story. Want is wrong. I didn't want to write a story about it. I had to write a story about it because, after the initial elation of surviving the experience and of getting through it, and the sort of weird mundane quality of living through it, I found that, like a lot of people, I was shaken by it. And that didn't become fully clear until a couple of days after the event, when I would get sort of panic attacks. And panic attacks is wrong, but I would be in a grocery store or something, and I would suddenly have this sense of not just alarm, but this need to run around and tell people to get out because they didn't realize how much danger they were in. And, it was weird and unsettling. And I had been kicking around for a long time an idea kind of like that Pincher Martin story that I was just talking about, which would center on a fantasy adventure of some sort that turned out to be this kind of traumatic event. So that's what I wrote. Once the idea came to me, and I had a sort of sketch, a rough outline of something that I had been working on before, and I took sort of some of the building blocks of that story, reconfigured it. I hadn't written anything per se, so I still had to write the book, the story itself. And the outline got changed and refitted for my purposes. But the novel itself, I wrote in 2 weeks, which is crazy. But it was one of those things where I just didn't really have a choice. Once the process started, I ate and I slept and I wrote. And it just sort of poured out. And then I put it aside and I edited it and started sharing it with people. So of course the entire process took a lot longer than that, but the initial draft, where 95% of the story was done, was really done in 2 weeks. And what I like about it is that it gave me a way. It gave me a way to sort of move through the experience, move past it, make it manageable somehow. But it also gave me a way to talk about something traumatic obliquely, which is one of the things that I like about fantasy and science fiction, because it allows us to come at real world problems kind of at an angle or through a distorting lens of some sort, which allows us to see them in slightly different ways. And to do so in a way that was unabashedly fictional, right? So I didn't have to worry about representing the actual event that I lived through or the people involved in it. I didn't want to do that. That would have been disrespectful. So I wanted it to be a fictional story, but a fictional story that was grounded in something real, and that's what I went for. So whether it works or not is another question. When we submitted it initially, most of the big publishers didn't want to know, and I think some of what they didn't want to know about, I mean, it's always tricky when you're dealing with potentially controversial material, but I think that one of the reasons they didn't want to know was that I was treating a very real, serious problem in a fictional way and in a fantasy way, right? It wasn't an issue book per se. It was something different, something a bit more. It was an adventure. It was playful and such. Though I think that those things in no way take away from the seriousness of the book or the weight of it, particularly in terms of the way that the story concludes. Whether you agree or not, I guess, is up to you. As I said, the UK edition. This is the US edition. The UK edition, which has not reached me yet because of, again, COVID and mailing's been taking a long time, has a very different kind of cover, which I think emphasizes the fantasy element and the YA element more than the US edition, which I think emphasizes the trauma, the upturned chair, which you see in the corner, I think, which was an image that is central to the story and was one of the things that, when we were talking about cover art, it was one of the things that I wanted to see represented, or at least to play with as an idea. And some of that distinction may be the difference between the way that we deal with guns in America as opposed to the way they deal with guns in the UK, which is largely that they don't deal with guns in the UK. And so I think the fantasy dimension has a slightly different feel to over there than it does here, which I understand because that's where I grew up. So anyway, yeah, that's I think that's all I'm going to say for now. But if people find these kind of little discussions interesting, then maybe I'll do some more and work through my back catalogue and talk about what I still like, what maybe I wish I'd done differently, things like that. Thanks for watching. If you get a chance, pick up a copy of Impervious and let me know what you think. Thanks.